A young Christian maiden refused to bow before the idols of Rome. For that defiance, she was condemned to die. In the crowded arena of Chalcedon, Euphemia, fragile, unarmed, steadfast, was cast into the sand among roaring beasts. Blood stained the ground, yet her spirit did not falter. Her death became an undying symbol of courage and faith in the age of persecution. In the late 3rd century, the Roman Empire stood on the edge of collapse. Chalcedon, a bustling city on the eastern shore of the Bosporus today within modern Turkey, was no stranger to the storms shaking the empire. Civil wars had fractured unity. Barbarian incursions tested the borders. Plagues had thinned populations, and economic decline gnawed at every market stall. The empire's rulers believed the crisis was not merely political or military but spiritual. To restore order, they sought to revive devotion to the Roman gods, binding the people once more under the sacred protection of Jupiter, Mars, and Apollo. For ordinary citizens of Chalcedon, religion was not confined to temples. It filled the streets with processions, poured incense over public squares, and demanded participation in rituals that were as civic as they were sacred. To decline an offering was to insult not only the gods but the emperor himself, who claimed divine favor as the source of his authority. The social contract depended on sacrifice. Yet, beneath this surface of ritual unity, small communities of Christians quietly gathered in houses and hidden chambers. They prayed not to the many gods of Rome, but to one Lord. For them, idolatry was sin, and offering incense to an idol was a betrayal of conscience. Their numbers were still small, but their faith was stubborn. To the authorities, such refusal was rebellion. It threatened the fragile glue holding the empire together. Into this atmosphere of chaos and coercion, Euphemia was born. She entered a world where every Christian choice carried the weight of life or death, where one's allegiance was measured not only by taxes or laws, but by the willingness to cast a handful of incense on a pagan altar. The empire's demand was simple: worship or perish. Chalcedon's amphitheater, with its rows of stone benches and central arena, symbolized this ruthless logic. Here, justice was performed as spectacle. Mercy drowned in the roar of the crowd. Those who defied imperial will could expect their punishment not in shadow but under the sun, with thousands of eyes watching. For Euphemia, the city that nurtured her faith, would one day become the stage of her martyrdom. Euphemia grew up in a Christian household, raised in the rhythms of prayer, scripture, and service. From childhood, she was taught that purity of heart was a treasure greater than gold, and that her body was a temple consecrated to Christ. As she matured, she made a vow of virginity not out of disdain for marriage, but as a radical act of devotion. To her, remaining untouched was to belong wholly to God. In the Roman imagination, such vows were incomprehensible. A young woman's worth was measured by alliances she could secure through marriage, by the heirs she could produce, and by the civic role she played in family life. To stand outside that system was scandalous. To do so for the sake of a crucified man worshipped by a despised sect was dangerous. But Euphemia's resolve only deepened as persecutions flared. Her quiet confidence became a beacon for others, a living contradiction to Rome's demand for conformity. While other girls her age were groomed for betrothal and dowry negotiations, she prepared herself through fasting and prayer. In the secrecy of Christian gatherings, she sang psalms that declared Christ alone as king, words that in public would be considered treasonous. The authorities did not see a harmless girl. They saw defiance wrapped in innocence. For them, her virginity was not just a personal vow but a political act, a refusal to let her body and soul be claimed by the empire. Each time she declined to bow at a shrine, she challenged the emperor's authority. Each prayer uttered in defiance was, in Roman eyes, a crack in the foundation of imperial power. Thus, Euphemia became more than a believer. She became a symbol of the tension between two worlds: the empire of Rome, glittering but fragile, and the kingdom of God, invisible yet unyielding. Her quiet rebellion was a sword sharper than steel, and though she did not seek the fight, it was clear that one day the empire would answer her faith with blood. The reign of Diocletian marked one of the fiercest persecutions in the history of the early church. Beginning in 303 AD, his edicts outlawed Christian worship, ordered the destruction of churches, and demanded that all sacred writings be burned. Across the empire, officials were instructed to compel citizens to prove their loyalty by sacrificing to the gods. To refuse was to court imprisonment, torture, and execution. In Chalcedon, these decrees fell like a storm. Soldiers marched through narrow streets, dragging suspected Christians from their homes. Families were torn apart in midnight raids. Fear filled the air like smoke after a fire. Yet the Christian community refused to scatter completely. They gathered quietly in hidden rooms, whispering prayers that became more dangerous than weapons. Euphemia was among them. Though barely more than a girl, she stood shoulder to shoulder with older believers, lending her voice to hymns sung in secret. When the imperial officers raided one of these gatherings, she was seized along with 48 other Christians. They were accused not of theft or treason, but of failing to honor the gods of Rome. For the authorities, the arrests served as both punishment and warning. Public trials were designed to break the courage of believers and frighten the undecided. A few recanted under pressure, throwing incense on the altars to save their lives. But others, including Euphemia, stood silent and unyielding. Her youth, rather than sparing her, seemed only to inflame the anger of the magistrates. How dare a girl defy the emperor? The prisons of Chalcedon overflowed with those awaiting judgment. Iron shackles bit into wrists and ankles. Food was scarce, water foul, and the stench unbearable. In these dark cells, faith was tested as much as in the arena. Yet witnesses later claimed that Euphemia never faltered. She encouraged her fellow prisoners with simple words, reminding them that Christ had endured suffering before them and would meet them beyond death. Thus, the persecution that swept across the empire swept Euphemia into its current. Her capture was not random but inevitable. Her faith had drawn the gaze of Rome, and Rome would not rest until she bowed or bled. When Euphemia was brought before Priscus, the governor of Bithynia, the proceedings were intended to be a spectacle. Roman justice was not private, it was theater. Crowds gathered in the forum to watch the accused answer charges, their fate hinging on words spoken under the gaze of magistrates and idols. Priscus confronted Euphemia with a simple command: offer sacrifice to the gods, and live. The altar stood nearby, smoke rising from embers, a bowl of incense within reach. To the officials, the act was trivial, a mere gesture of loyalty. But to Euphemia, it was betrayal. She answered calmly, her voice clear enough for all to hear. She declared that she could not worship lifeless idols carved by human hands. Her Lord, she said, was Christ alone. In that moment, the trial became more than a legal proceeding. It was a contest of sovereignties. Priscus represented the empire, with its legions and laws. Euphemia stood for a kingdom unseen, armed only with conviction. The governor pressed her again, offering threats and promises. She could be spared, he insisted, if she would only comply. Wealth, security, even marriage could be hers. But Euphemia refused. To accept meant denying her faith. To deny meant losing herself. She chose instead to embrace the path of martyrdom. The crowd murmured, some in admiration, others in anger. For the authorities, her refusal was intolerable. To let such defiance pass would invite others to resist. By rejecting the altar, Euphemia had sealed her fate. The record of her trial would echo for centuries, not as the triumph of Rome, but as the testimony of a girl who dared to stand against it. The Roman authorities had little patience for defiance, and none at all for a young woman who dared to resist publicly. After Euphemia's trial, she was dragged back to prison, but this time not to await a verdict. The verdict was already clear. The governor's order was simple. She was to be tortured until she either renounced her faith or perished under the strain. Accounts preserved in hagiography tell of the brutal attempts to break her spirit. She was shackled to a wooden frame, her body stretched until her joints ached with every breath. Soldiers struck her with rods, their blows echoing against the stone walls of the cell. Fire was brought to her skin, searing her arms and shoulders, as iron instruments pressed into her flesh. Yet Euphemia's response confounded her captors. Instead of cries of despair, they heard prayers. She whispered psalms as though her pain were a hymn, and her silence in the face of agony unsettled even the hardened guards. Some accounts suggest that the instruments themselves failed, as if dulled by divine power. Whether legend or truth, what remained undeniable was her refusal to bend. The purpose of such cruelty was not only punishment, but humiliation. Rome sought to strip away her dignity, to reduce her to submission. But the very chains that bound her seemed, to the Christian imagination, like the ornaments of martyrdom. Her wounds became badges of fidelity, each scar a declaration that the empire could wound her body, but never claim her soul. In the darkness of the cell, Euphemia prayed for her persecutors. This detail, repeated in many retellings, became central to her story. She did not curse those who harmed her, but interceded for them. The paradox of love in the midst of cruelty elevated her suffering into a testimony. For those who later heard her story, the image of a bleeding virgin praying for her tormentors became a vision of Christ-like endurance. Days of torture passed, but no surrender came. The officials realized that pain could not undo her vow. What remained was the ultimate sentence, death in the arena. Before the eyes of thousands, Euphemia's suffering in prison had failed to silence her. Instead, it prepared her for the final confrontation, where her body would become both sacrifice and sermon. The governor Priscus could no longer tolerate the spectacle of resistance. To the empire, disobedience could not remain hidden in a prison cell. It had to be crushed in public. A message had to be carved into the memory of Chalcedon's citizens. Those who defied Rome would meet a fate both terrifying and humiliating. Thus, the final sentence was pronounced. Euphemia, the Christian virgin, was to be thrown to the beasts in the amphitheater. The decree was read aloud with ceremonial formality, as though it were a matter of state rather than the execution of a young girl. The symbolism was deliberate. The arena represented Rome's power to command life and death, to turn justice into spectacle, and to transform punishment into entertainment. For the Christians who heard the news, grief mingled with awe. They knew that Euphemia's end would be brutal, but they also recognized that her refusal to yield had transformed her into more than an individual. She was now a witness, a martyr, one whose blood would become a seed for faith in others. Roman authorities prepared the arena with grim efficiency. The sand was raked, the cages of lions and other beasts readied. Announcements spread through the city, drawing crowds eager to watch. To many, it was simply another day of diversion, a chance to thrill at violence staged beneath the Sunday. Few understood that they would be witnessing a moment destined for history. Euphemia awaited her fate with composure. In the prison's stillness, she prayed, her eyes lifted beyond the walls to the God she served. Her body bore the marks of torture, yet her spirit seemed untouched, her resolve sharper than iron. Guards who escorted her to and from the tribunal whispered about her serenity, unsettled by the contrast between her frail figure and unshakable courage. When the day of the execution drew near, it was clear that Euphemia's trial was not meant to end in mercy. Rome demanded blood, but the Christians of Chalcedon would remember it differently. For them, the governor's decree had not condemned her, it had crowned her. What Priscus saw as the destruction of rebellion, the faithful saw as the consummation of faith. Thus the stage was set. The amphitheater, the beasts, the crowd, and at the center, a girl whose only crime was fidelity to a god higher than Rome. The sentence, meant to extinguish her defiance, would instead ignite a legacy that no decree could erase. The day of Euphemia's execution arrived like a festival, though it was one of cruelty rather than joy. The amphitheater of Chalcedon stood ready, its stone seats filled with citizens, merchants, soldiers, and officials. The roar of the crowd mixed with the braying of trumpets and the clatter of soldiers' armor. For Rome, executions were not only punishments but public rituals meant to display power, entertain the masses, and remind every witness who truly ruled the world. Into this charged atmosphere, Euphemia was led. Her body bore the marks of torture, bruises, burns, and scars that testified to days of suffering. But her expression remained calm. Dressed simply, with her hands bound, she walked as though stepping into a sanctuary rather than an arena. For many, this composure was unsettling. The crowd had come to see fear and panic, but what they saw was serenity. The governor and magistrates presided from their elevated seats, ensuring that Rome's justice was enacted with formality. Heralds proclaimed her crime: refusal to honor the gods, obstinacy against the emperor, rebellion clothed as piety. To the pagans, these words justified the spectacle about to unfold. To the Christians present, they were a badge of honor. As Euphemia entered the arena's center, she lifted her gaze upward. Witnesses later claimed that her lips moved in prayer, whispering words lost beneath the noise of the multitude. She did not plead for mercy from the governor or the crowd. She sought strength from the God she had vowed to serve until death. The heat of the midday sun bore down on the sand, casting long shadows of the iron gates that held back the beasts. Soldiers stationed at the edges tightened their grips on spears, ready to intervene if necessary. The anticipation thickened, silence briefly falling over the amphitheater as if even the crowd held its breath. Then the gates creaked. The spectacle was about to begin. For the Romans, this was justice. For Euphemia, it was an offering. She stood, fragile yet unflinching, prepared to meet the end that had been chosen for her. The amphitheater, once merely a place of games, became in that moment the stage of witness, where the blood of a virgin would mingle with the dust of empire. The iron doors swung open, and the first lion emerged. Its mane glistened in the sunlight, its eyes fixed on the lone figure standing in the arena. The crowd erupted with shouts, expecting terror, expecting flight. Yet Euphemia did not move. Her hands remained folded in prayer, her gaze lifted beyond the beast to something unseen. The lion prowled slowly, circling her with a predator's patience. Other beasts followed: bears, leopards, or perhaps more lions, depending on which account survives. Their growls filled the air, echoing against the amphitheater's stone. The scene was designed to terrify, but in the eyes of many witnesses, it took on a different character. According to Christian tradition, the animals at first hesitated. Some drew close but did not strike, as though restrained by a force beyond nature. The crowd murmured in confusion, some mocking, others awed. Roman officials grew restless, the spectacle was faltering. Yet for the faithful, this pause was a sign. Creation itself recognized the innocence of the martyr. Eventually, one of the beasts lunged. The impact threw Euphemia to the ground, and blood stained the sand. But even in that moment of violence, the image that endured was not her suffering but her prayer. Her lips continued to move, whispering words of forgiveness and intercession. She prayed. It was said, not only for her fellow Christians but for her executioners, for the empire that condemned her, and for the very crowd that now cheered her pain. The arena echoed with conflicting sounds, cheers of delight from those entertained, gasps of awe from those who sensed something sacred unfolding. The authorities saw only victory, a stubborn girl crushed by Rome's might, but among the crowd were hearts pierced by the sight of faith unbroken, by the contrast between brutal force and serene devotion. When the beast released her, she lay weakened, her body broken yet her spirit unyielding. The sand of Chalcedon bore witness to a paradox, that in death she triumphed. The spectacle meant to dishonor her instead magnified her courage. The blood that darkened the ground became, for future generations, a seal of testimony that no empire, however mighty, could silence the voice of conscience. The final moments of Euphemia's life unfolded beneath the relentless sun, as the crowd watched a drama that was both brutal and transcendent. The beasts had done their work, and her body lay torn upon the arena floor. Yet what lingered in the memories of those present was not merely the violence, but the unshakable faith that marked her passing. Hagiographical accounts tell of a fragrance that spread across the amphitheater, a sweet, unearthly aroma rising from the blood-stained sand. Some described it as the scent of lilies, others as incense. To Christians, it was a sign of divine favor, a mark that heaven had received her sacrifice. The very air, once thick with dust and fear, seemed transformed into a sanctuary. Witnesses whispered of other wonders, that Euphemia's lips moved even after her body fell still, as though her spirit continued to pray, that the beasts withdrew, calmed as if their rage had been spent on something beyond them. Such details cannot be proven, but they became part of the tradition, shaping the way her death was remembered. What is certain is that many who witnessed her martyrdom were deeply moved. Some pagans in the crowd, struck by her courage, began to question the justice of the empire. A few even sought baptism in secret, convinced that the God for whom she died must be greater than the gods of Rome. For the Christian community of Chalcedon, her death was both a wound and a gift. Their grief was sharpened by the loss of a beloved sister, yet their faith was strengthened by the testimony she had offered. Rome intended to terrify, but instead, Euphemia's death inspired. Her name began to spread beyond Chalcedon, carried by travelers, merchants, and pilgrims. She became a symbol not only of endurance but of divine triumph in weakness. In her broken body, believers saw a mirror of Christ himself, whose own suffering had turned defeat into victory. Thus, in the paradox of martyrdom, her end was not an end at all. It was a beginning, a seed planted in blood, destined to blossom in the memory of the Church. After Euphemia's death, the Christians of Chalcedon risked their lives to recover her body. They buried her with reverence, turning her grave into a place of prayer and pilgrimage. Stories of her martyrdom traveled quickly, reaching other communities across Asia Minor and beyond. Her name was inscribed among the saints, her courage celebrated in hymns and liturgies. By the 5th century, her tomb had become so revered that the Council of Chalcedon, the great gathering of bishops in 451 AD, was held near her resting place. The choice was deliberate, for the Church sought her spiritual protection and her witness to truth. In that council, which defined the nature of Christ as fully human and fully divine, Her presence was invoked as a symbol of fidelity to the faith. The fathers of the council believed that the Virgin who had shed her blood for Christ would intercede as they sought clarity and unity. Her legacy extended further still. Churches were dedicated in her honor, relics attributed to her were venerated, and her feast day became a time of remembrance. She was no longer only the martyr of Chalcedon, she was the saint of the universal church. For generations of Christians, Euphemia embodied the paradox of the gospel, that weakness could be strength, that death could give life, and that the empire's cruelty could be answered not with rebellion, but with steadfast faith. Her story reminded them that the might of Rome, with all its legions and decrees, was fleeting. What endured was the testimony of a girl who chose Christ over compromise, conscience over fear. Today, her memory continues to inspire. Icons portray her serene, often holding a cross or standing with the beasts that once surrounded her. Pilgrims still journey to the places connected with her life, seeking courage in their own struggles. And in every retelling of her martyrdom, the lesson resounds: faith, though fragile in the eyes of the world, is stronger than empires. Euphemia's death was meant to be a warning, a deterrent carved into the sand of the amphitheater. Instead, it became a beacon. Her name lives on, not in fear, but in honor, a reminder that one life, surrendered in fidelity, can echo across centuries.